A military working dog stood over an unconscious woman on a hospital gurney, teeth bared, hackles raised, and not a single doctor could get within 6 feet of the patient. Security backed against the walls. A trauma physician with 20 years of experience couldn't move. Then a quiet, overlooked nurse stepped forward, and the dog dropped its head instantly, exhaling like it had finally found the one person it had been waiting for. What happened next left an entire trauma department speechless. But 30 seconds before that moment, that same nurse had just been publicly humiliated in front of her entire team. If you've never seen a story flip completely upside down in the span of one shift, stay with me, because this one will wreck you in the best way. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming in the next parts. And if this kind of story hits different for you, drop a like and tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning started the way most mornings did at Harlow Cross Medical Center: loud, understaffed, and unkind. Harlow Cross sat on the eastern edge of Denton Falls, Colorado, a mid-sized city that liked to think of itself as more cosmopolitan than it actually was. The hospital was a Level 2 trauma center, which meant it handled everything short of the most catastrophic cases, and it handled those cases with a staff that was perpetually overworked and chronically underpaid. The building itself was 12 stories of beige concrete and fluorescent lighting, the kind of place where the smell of antiseptic was so constant it stopped registering after the first week. The ER occupied the entire ground floor east wing. It had 42 beds, 6 trauma bays, and a break room with a coffee machine that had been broken since February. The staff had learned to function without it, which said everything you needed to know about the people who worked there. Nurse Mara Solis arrived at 6:47 a.m. for a 7 o'clock shift, 13 minutes early the way she always was, and signed in at the nursing station without anyone looking up. That was also the way things usually went. She was 34, white, with dark blonde hair she kept pulled back in a low bun that never came loose no matter how long the shift ran. She had steady hands and quiet eyes, gray-green, the kind that looked like they were always calculating something. And she moved through a trauma bay with an economy of motion that should have been impossible to overlook. And yet, the charge nurse that morning was Diane Yates, a compact, brisk woman in her late 40s who communicated primarily in half-sentences and clipboard taps. She glanced up when Mara signed in, made a small noise that wasn't quite acknowledgement, and handed her a printout of the day's assignments without comment. Mara took it, scanned it, noted she'd been assigned 3 low-acuity patients in the observation wing again, the 3rd week in a row, and said nothing. She folded the paper, tucked it into her scrub pocket, and headed for the locker room. The locker room was empty at that hour except for 2 nurses from the outgoing night shift, both of them moving with the deliberate slowness of people who had been awake too long. Mara nodded to them. One nodded back. The other didn't look up. She changed into her work scrubs, plain blue, nothing on them, no pins or patches or personal touches, and sat for a moment on the bench with her bag between her feet. She did this every morning. Just one moment of stillness before the shift began. 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then she stood, squared her shoulders by exactly the amount needed to straighten her spine, and walked out. The ER was already picking up by the time she reached the floor. A man with a laceration across his forearm was being triaged near Bay 4. An elderly woman in a wheelchair was being walked through intake with what looked like a broken wrist. 2 paramedics were offloading a teenager from a gurney near the ambulance bay doors, rattling off vitals to a resident who was writing too fast and listening too slowly. Mara moved to the nursing station, pulled up the observation patients she'd been assigned, and started going through their charts with the same focused quiet she brought to everything. She was halfway through the 2nd chart when she heard the voice. Dr. Russell Holt. He was the kind of man who filled a room, not because of his size, which was average, but because of his certainty. He'd been the senior ER attending at Harlow Cross for 11 years, which meant he'd outlasted 3 department heads and 2 hospital restructurings, and he wore that tenure like armor. He was 51, gray at the temples, and he had a habit of speaking at a volume calibrated precisely to ensure the people he was addressing felt the full weight of everyone else hearing it too. He came around the corner from Bay 2 with a tablet in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, mid-sentence, with a group of residents who trailed behind him like ducklings navigating a current. Which is why I keep saying, if you can't read a chest x-ray in under 90 seconds, you need to go back to... He stopped when he saw Mara at the station, and his expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile. Soulless. She looked up. Dr. Holt? I noticed you put in a consult request yesterday afternoon on the Reyes patient, cardiac irregularities. He set his coffee cup down on the counter and picked up her notation from the physical chart beside her. He read it for approximately 4 seconds, then set it back down. Why? It wasn't a question, exactly. It was a test. His QRS intervals were widening on the afternoon strip, she said. Subtle, but consistent. I thought cardiology should see it. Cardiology flagged nothing. Cardiology saw him at 9 a.m. The widening showed up at 2:30. Holt looked at the residents. Not at her. At them. See, this is what happens when nurses start deciding what counts as a clinical concern. He picked up the chart again, flipped a page with deliberate slowness. The Reyes patient has anxiety disorder and runs narrow complex tachycardia when he's stressed, which he was because he'd been waiting 6 hours. That's it. That's the whole story. The pattern I noted wasn't tatch, Mara said. Her voice was the same temperature it had been when she started the sentence. I'm sure it looked concerning to you. He handed the chart back to her. Nurses follow protocol. They flag vitals. They don't make diagnostic calls. And they don't pull in consultants based on... He paused, a small performative hesitation. Pattern recognition hunches. We clear on that? The residents were very still. One of them, a young woman in her second year named Torres, was looking at the floor. Yes, Mara said. Good. He picked up his coffee. Stick to your OBS wing today. You've got 3 patients. That's manageable. He walked away. The residents followed. Mara stood at the nursing station for exactly 2 seconds after he turned the corner. Then she pulled up the next chart and kept reading. Torres appeared at the edge of the station a few minutes later, pretending to look for something in a supply drawer. She didn't say anything for a moment, then quietly, He was wrong about the intervals. Don't, Mara said, but not worth it. She didn't look up from the chart. Go with your group. Torres hesitated, then went. The OBS wing was quieter than the main floor, which Mara didn't mind. She moved through her 3 patients with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Medication checks, vitals, addressing change on a post-procedure patient that she completed so cleanly, the woman actually said thank you twice. She made notes, updated charts, flagged one medication timing issue with the pharmacy that got corrected within the hour. She ate a granola bar standing at the hallway window at 9:45 because she wouldn't have time to sit, and she watched the parking lot below in the flat winter light and thought about nothing in particular. At 10:20, the radio on Diane's desk crackled with something Mara heard from 12 feet away. Inbound trauma, ETA 6 minutes. Female, early 20s, unconscious, blunt force abdominal trauma, BP 70 overpalp, service animal on scene. Handlers cannot remove. Repeat, cannot remove service animal. We need a plan for that. Diane's voice came back sharp and fast. What do you mean cannot remove? The dog is trained protection, ma'am. It is not responding to handlers. It is, ma'am, it is guarding the patient and it will not stand down. We have tried. We need you to have a plan. There was a pause, then Diane's voice again tighter. Get animal control on the phone. Animal control is already en route. They say minimum 15 minutes. The patient doesn't have 15 minutes. What's the dog doing right now? Sitting on the gurney with her, not biting, just another pause. Ma'am, it's not going to move. Mara put her granola bar wrapper in the trash and walked back to the main floor. The trauma bay was already being prepped when she got there. 2 nurses were pulling equipment. A respiratory tech was positioning the ventilator. Holt was standing near the entrance with his arms crossed, already processing the situation and clearly unhappy with all of it. 2 security guards hovered near the ambulance bay doors, looking at each other. If the dog is stable, we trank it and move on, Holt said, to no one specific. Veterinary clearance for that takes time we might not have, said the charge nurse. Then we work around it. Oh, we can't work around a 60-pound trained military dog in a trauma bay, Dr. Holt. Mara moved to the edge of the bay and started pulling on gloves. Solis, Holt's voice. Your obs wing. I heard the call, she said. You need hands. I need people who are assigned to trauma, not... The ambulance bay doors banged open. The gurney came through fast, 2 paramedics pushing it hard, a third one moving alongside talking in clipped bursts of vital signs. The patient was young, early 20s, dark hair splayed across the backboard, skin a gray-white color that meant she'd been bleeding for a while. An oxygen mask was already on her face. The IV lines in her arms were running wide open. And on the gurney with her, wedged between her left arm and the side rail, was the dog. It was a Belgian Malinois, compact and dense with muscle, maybe 65 pounds, with a matte black tactical vest strapped across its back. The vest had patches on it, the kind sewn down with military precision, and the dog wore it the way a soldier wears gear, like it had never not had it on. The animal was pressed against the patient's side, not sitting but braced, with its head up and its eyes moving in fast, deliberate sweeps across the room. Not panicked, not aggressive in the frantic way of a frightened animal, just watching, cataloging, making assessments. The moment the gurney crossed into the trauma bay, the dog's gaze swept the assembled staff and something in its posture shifted. It pressed closer to the patient. All right, everybody back, said the lead paramedic, which was almost funny given that nobody had moved forward to begin with. This dog has not responded to any commands from any of us, and the trainer on scene couldn't get close enough to... Get it out of my bay, Holt said. Sir, we have tried. Then try harder. He stepped forward, the dog's lip lifted. Not a snarl, not yet, just a single, controlled display. A warning given once with total economy. Holt stopped. The 2 security guards moved toward the gurney from the left side, and the dog turned its head toward them with a precision that made both of them slow without deciding to. Everybody stop moving, said one of the paramedics. Nobody was moving. The patient's monitor, the transport monitor, still attached, was alarming. BP 68 over nothing. Heart rate 132 and climbing. She was going to crash inside the next 4 minutes if they didn't get her to a surgeon, and they couldn't get to her because a dog would not move. And the dog would not move because something in it had decided that every person in this room was a threat. Mara was still standing at the edge of the bay. She hadn't put gloves on yet. She was looking at the dog. Not at its posture or its teeth or its vest. She was looking at the vest, specifically at a small patch on the left shoulder panel, about 2 inches square, in a color that wasn't quite black and wasn't quite navy. She'd have had to explain the patch's design to anyone who asked, except that she wouldn't have, because the people who knew what that patch meant had signed agreements ensuring they would not. She knew what it meant. Her hands were very still at her sides. Move, she said. Not loudly. Not to anyone in particular, or to everyone at once, which was a different thing. The staff parted. She walked forward. Solis, Holt's voice behind her, low and careful in a way it hadn't been before. What are you... She didn't stop. She crossed the bay floor with the same unhurried movement she brought to everything, and she stopped 2 feet from the gurney, and she looked at the dog directly. It looked back at her. Its ears were fully forward, and its body was rigid, and its eyes were the amber gold color of something that had been trained past the point most people understood. She held its gaze. Then, very quietly, she said 2 words. Ridgeline, down. The dog's ears moved first, 1 slight rotation, then its head dropped by 2 inches, then its whole body seemed to settle, some internal calculation completing, and it stepped back from the patient and sat. Not lay down. Sat, at strict attention at the foot of the gurney, watching her. The monitor was still screaming. Mara turned to the team. BP's crashing. She's got abdominal rigidity. I felt it when I passed the gurney. She's bleeding somewhere in there, probably splenic or hepatic. We need a fast exam right now, and we need the OR on standby. She was already moving, reaching for the ultrasound wand. Who has the IV access? Is that a 16 in the left AC? Give me blood products, 2 units of packed red cells, and get me a type and cross. Now. For half a second, nobody moved. Then Torres moved, and then the respiratory tech moved, and then the whole bay was moving. Holt stood at the edge of the controlled chaos and watched the nurse who was supposed to be in the observation wing run his trauma bay with the kind of practiced authority that doesn't come from nursing school. The FAST exam took 40 seconds. Mara ran the probe herself, reading the screen in real time, narrating what she saw without looking away from it. Free fluid in Morrison's pouch. More here. Parasplenic. This is significant hemorrhage. She needs the OR in the next 10 minutes, or we're having a different conversation. She pulled the probe back, handed it off, and looked at Holt directly. Do you want to call it, or should I? There was a half second where something moved across his face that wasn't something she'd seen there before. Get OR Suite 2 on the phone, he said. To the room, not to her. But he said it. She was already at the patient's head, checking the airway, adjusting the oxygen mask, talking to the unconscious woman in a low, steady voice, even though the woman couldn't hear her. It was habit. It was something she'd learned a long time ago in places that didn't look anything like this trauma bay, in conditions that made this look orderly by comparison, that you talked to patients anyway, that you told them what you were doing, that you didn't let them be alone even when they were unconscious, because the body remembered even when the mind wasn't present to receive. At the foot of the gurney, the dog sat at attention and watched her work. The nurses exchanged looks over the patient's body, short looks, the kind that didn't require words. The OR team arrived with the transport gurney at the 12-minute mark. Mara helped transfer the patient with the kind of smooth, deliberate efficiency that kept lines intact and airways secured, and she stepped back as the gurney moved toward the elevator, and she stood in the middle of the bay with her gloves still on while the room reorganized around her. The dog didn't follow the patient. It walked across the bay floor and sat down next to Mara's left leg and stayed there. Holt was watching from the doorway. He hadn't spoken in several minutes. Someone, Mara thought it was one of the day nurses, Carver, or maybe Pruitt, said something under their breath. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone. The question inside it, who is she? She pulled off her gloves and dropped them in the biohazard bin and picked up the chart the paramedics had left behind. The patient's information was sparse. A name, partial address, the responding unit's notes, and a line at the bottom that said in capital letters, Military working dog present, handler, unavailable, contact info pending. Mara looked at that line for a moment longer than was necessary. Then she clipped the chart to the rack and went to find a pair of clean gloves and went back to work, because there were 2 other patients in the OBS wing who needed their morning medications, and the shift wasn't going to run itself. The dog followed her. She let it. Nobody stopped her. Nobody quite knew what to say about the fact that the Belgian Malinois in the military vest was padding silently through the hallways of Harlow Cross Medical Center's East Wing like it owned the place. Diane watched it pass the nursing station and opened her mouth and then closed it again. An orderly pressed himself against the wall. A patient in room 14 looked up from his phone, looked at the dog, looked back at his phone, and decided it wasn't his problem. Mara completed her medication rounds with the dog sitting at attention outside each room, waiting for her to exit, and then falling back into step behind her. She noted the patient in room 12 had a slight temperature spike from that morning's reading and paged the covering resident. She adjusted the fluid rate on the patient in room 10 based on the afternoon labs that had just posted. Standard, routine, the kind of work that never got noticed when it was done correctly and only registered when it wasn't. She was charting at the small workstation near the OBS wing elevator when Diane appeared around the corner, clipboard in hand, with the expression of a woman who had been composing a conversation for the last 20 minutes and wasn't sure any version of it was going to land right. The OR called, Diane said. Your patient is stable. They got the bleeding under control. She's going to recovery. Good, Mara said. Diane was quiet for a moment. The dog was sitting 4 feet away watching the hallway. How did you know the splenic? FAST showed free fluid. Pattern of distribution suggested perisplenic source. She didn't look up from the chart. Before the FAST, when you came into the bay. Mara finished the sentence she was typing. Mechanism of injury, presentation, the rigidity I mentioned, experience. Mara, Diane's voice shifted into something less administrative. That command you gave. The dog. Mara looked up at her. Diane was watching her with the expression of someone trying to figure out what they were actually looking at. Not hostile, just recalibrating. Where did you learn that? The dog has a tactical vest, Mara said. There are protocols for handling trained military working dogs in civilian settings. I did some reading once. She looked back at the chart. That's all. Diane held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the dog. Then she looked back at Mara. Then she wrote something on her clipboard and walked away without another word. Mara stared at the monitor in front of her and did not think about the patch on the dog's vest, and did not think about the word she had said, and did not think about the particular program that word had once been assigned to, in the particular time in her life when she had been the person those programs relied on, before she had decided, or had been forced to decide, which were different things, to become someone else entirely. She thought about the patient in room 12 and her temperature and whether the resident was going to take the page seriously or need a follow-up. Outside the window at the end of the hall, in the hospital's main parking lot, 3 black SUVs pulled in through the entrance and stopped in a line near the emergency department doors. They didn't go to the visitor spaces. They stopped where they stopped, like they knew they were going to, and 4 doors opened and men in civilian clothes that didn't look like civilian clothes got out and moved toward the building's entrance with the practiced ground-eating stride of people who had been trained to move through spaces efficiently and had never quite stopped doing it even when the context changed. Mara didn't see this from where she was sitting, but the dog's head came up sharply, its ears rotating forward, its whole body orienting toward the south wall like it had heard something through the concrete. Its tail moved once. The dog's ears were still forward when Mara finally looked up from the chart. She wasn't sure what made her do it. Some peripheral awareness, the kind that doesn't announce itself but sits at the base of the skull and taps until you pay attention. She looked at the dog, then at the wall it was facing, and then she made herself look back at the monitor and finish the entry she'd been working on. Patient in room 12. Temperature 99.8, up from 98.6 at morning rounds. Resident paged at 1432. She logged it and closed the chart and told herself it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. She'd learned a long time ago that when trained animals oriented like that, with that particular quality of stillness, that forward-weighted attention, they were responding to something real. But she wasn't in a position to act on that right now, and the patient in room 10 needed a fluid check, and the resident she'd paged had not yet called back. She stood up. "Come on," she said to the dog. It fell into step beside her left leg without hesitation. She did the fluid check. She updated the chart. The resident called back 7 minutes later. A young man named Parrish, who had the voice of someone who'd been asleep and was trying to hide it, and she gave him the temperature data in 2 sentences and told him what she thought he should do, and waited while he decided to agree with her and frame it as his own idea. Standard. She wrote it in the chart as his order, which is what it was going to be regardless, because that's how it worked. It was Carver who found her first. Day nurse, 10 years at Harlow Cross, the kind of woman who knew everything about the floor and shared it selectively. She appeared at the obese wing entrance with her arms crossed, and her eyebrows doing something complicated. "There are men downstairs," she said. "I know." Carver's eyebrows moved further. "You know. I saw the SUVs from the window earlier." She was updating the 3rd chart. "How many came in?" 4 that I saw, maybe 5. They're at the ER desk talking to Diane." Carver paused. "They're not family, Mara." "I know that too." "They're asking about the patient from this morning, the trauma patient." Mara stopped typing. "And," Carver continued, "they're asking about the dog." The dog was sitting at the entrance to room 10, watching Carver with the focused patience of an animal that had been trained to assess humans quickly and had formed its opinion already. "What did Diane tell them?" Mara asked. "That the patient is in recovery, that the dog is with a staff member, that she'd need to verify who they were before she said anything else." Carver tilted her head. "Diane actually said that. I was a little surprised. She's been charge nurse for 14 years. She's not going to hand over patient information to men in black SUVs just because they look official." They are official, that's the thing. Carver lowered her voice even though there was nobody near them. One of them showed something to Marcus at the security desk, and Marcus just stepped out of the way and let them through. Mara absorbed this. Are they coming up here? Not yet. They're still at the ER desk, but Holt is with them now. That was the part that settled in her chest like a stone. Not the men themselves, not the SUVs, not even the patch on the dog's vest that she wasn't supposed to recognize. Holt with them. Holt, who had spent the better part of the morning making sure everyone in the department understood that her job was to follow protocol and manage 3 low-acuity patients and not have opinions about things above her pay grade. She wondered what he was saying. She decided it didn't matter yet. Okay, she said. Okay? Carver repeated. Mara? Okay, what? Okay, I heard you. Thank you. She saved the chart and stood up. I'm going to finish my rounds. Carver stared at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who had been anticipating a more interesting reaction and was processing the disappointment. Then she unfolded her arms and shrugged and went back to the main floor, and Mara finished her rounds. It was 40 minutes later when Diane appeared in the obs wing with a different look on her face than the one she'd worn during their earlier conversation. That one had been curious, recalibrating. This one was careful. The way a person looks when they've been given information that's changed the shape of a situation and they're still working out what it means. There are people downstairs who want to speak with you, she said. I heard. Military. Diane said the word like she was testing its weight, or something adjacent to military. They identified themselves as federal investigators. Did they give you a specific agency? They gave me a name. Diane paused. Investigative Support Division, Joint Special Operations Command. I looked it up on my phone in the bathroom. There's almost nothing about it online. That's usually intentional, Mara said. Diane was quiet for a beat. You're not surprised. I'm not surprised. She folded the chart she'd been holding. Did they say what they want to talk about? The patient, the dog. Another pause. And you. The dog's tail moved once, the way it had before, and Mara looked down at it. Its amber eyes were watching the elevator at the end of the hall, waiting for something it had already decided was coming. I'll come down, Mara said. Give me 5 minutes. Diane looked like she wanted to ask something else. She didn't. She nodded and walked back to the elevator, and her footsteps were measured in a way that meant she was thinking hard about every step. Mara went to the bathroom at the end of the obs wing, which was the closest thing to a private space available to her. She stood at the sink with the water running and looked at herself in the mirror, and did the thing she'd learned to do in the years before this one, when this kind of moment happened with regularity, which was to find the still place behind her sternum, the place that didn't react to context, and let it hold the weight for a minute. It wasn't meditation. She'd never been able to sit still long enough for meditation. It was closer to a calibration, like adjusting an instrument before use. The woman in the mirror looked like a nurse. Blue scrubs, low bun, no makeup because there was no point in a trauma environment. She looked competent and unremarkable, which was exactly what she'd spent 3 years building. 3 years at Harlow Cross, 9 months before that, at a smaller clinic in a town outside Denver where no one had asked her much about herself, and before that, a series of things she had structured her entire post-military life around not thinking about during work hours. She turned off the water and dried her hands and walked out. The dog was waiting in the hallway. It had not moved an inch. They took the elevator down together, the dog sitting pressed against her left leg, and when the doors opened on the ground floor, she could see from across the ER that the group near the nursing station had grown. There were 5 men now, where Carver had counted 4. 4 of them were standing in the loose, watchful configuration of people trained to maintain sight lines. The 5th was talking to Holt. He was the one she noticed. Not because of anything dramatic, not height or bearing or the kind of entrance a protagonist makes in a story. He was around 50, maybe a few years over, with close-cropped hair going gray at the edges, and the kind of face that had been through enough that it had stopped being expressive by default. He was wearing a dark jacket over a collared shirt, and he was listening to Holt speak with the focused attention of a man who was being polite, but had already made his assessment and was simply waiting for the other person to finish. He looked toward the elevator when the doors opened. He didn't look at the dog first. He looked at Mara. She kept walking. Holt saw her coming and his posture shifted, something between relief and something she couldn't name, which was unusual for Holt, who was normally very easy to read because he didn't see a reason to hide his reactions. He'd never needed to. "Solis," he said, "these men would like to talk to you." "So I heard." She stopped at a reasonable conversational distance and looked at the man in the dark jacket. "Mara Solis, I'm a nurse here." "I know who you are," the man said. He had a voice that matched his face, flat, contained, not unfriendly, but not warm. The voice of someone who'd spent a long time in environments where warmth was a liability. "I'm Special Agent David Wren," he said. "Investigative Support Division. I have credentials if you want them." "Diane checked your ID downstairs. I'll take that as sufficient." She looked at him steadily. "What do you need?" "Can we find somewhere?" "Whatever you need to say, you can say here." She wasn't being provocative. She just knew from specific and relevant experience that private rooms with federal investigators created records that conversations in open hallways did not, and that given the particular shape of this situation, she wanted witnesses. Wren looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression that might have been the beginning of recognition. He nodded once, the way people nod when they encounter a choice they respect, even if they didn't anticipate it. "The patient who came in this morning," he said, "Nadia Reeves, 23 years old. She's in post-op recovery, stable. You'd need to speak with her surgical team about her medical status. I know her status. My team's been in contact with the OR." He paused. "Nadia Reeves is the daughter of Commander Garrett Reeves, Special Operations Command, currently assigned to a classified forward deployment. We've been trying to reach him for the last 4 hours. We're also trying to determine how his daughter ended up in a civilian ER in Denton Falls, Colorado, with a classified program working dog, when her last known location was 3 states away. The nursing station around them had gotten very quiet in the way that spaces get quiet when people are pretending to work while listening to every word. Mara said, "I can tell you what happened on this end. She came in by ambulance, blunt force abdominal trauma. The dog was with her and wouldn't respond to anyone. She went to surgery. She's going to be okay." "The dog responded to you?" "Yes." "How?" It wasn't the same question Diane had asked. It had the same words, but a different weight under them. "I'm familiar with military working dog protocols," Mara said. "I knew the right command." Wren looked at the dog. The dog had not moved from her left side since the elevator. It was sitting at strict attention, watching Wren with the same focused evaluation it had given everyone else, but without the edge it had shown in the trauma bay. It had made its assessment. "That's Atlas," Wren said. "He's a JSOC-assigned working dog. He's been with Commander Reeves' unit for 3 years. He has 26 known command words. They're classified, compartmented, and known only to 4 living people." He looked back at Mara. "The command you used isn't on any civilian training record. It's not in any public database. It doesn't exist anywhere a nurse at a Level 2 trauma center in Colorado should have access to." The ER had gotten very, very quiet. Holt was standing 6 feet away and he was very still. Mara held Wren's gaze. "That's an interesting observation," she said. "It's an interesting situation," he said back. "I'd like to understand it." "I imagine you would." They looked at each other for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. 2 people conducting a negotiation entirely in the space between what they were saying and what they weren't. "There's more," Wren said. "That's the part I need to speak with you about." He glanced at Holt, then at the nursing station, then back at her. "I understand you prefer the hallway, and that's fine, but I'm going to tell you something now, and I'd ask you to listen to it completely before you respond." She nodded. "We've been building an investigation for the last 7 months," he said. "It started as a data security review. Routine, the kind of thing we do periodically for facilities that treat personnel connected to classified units. It escalated when we started identifying a pattern of protected health information being accessed outside of normal clinical parameters. Accessed and extracted." He kept his voice level, matter of fact, the way investigators spoke when they were giving someone information they'd assembled carefully and didn't want interrupted. "The access points trace back to this hospital, to specific user credentials. to a pattern of behavior that has been consistent enough and specific enough that we've now moved it from a data review to an active federal investigation. Something very cold settled into the space behind Mara's sternum, where she'd found the still place 20 minutes ago. Someone in this hospital, Wren continued, has been extracting protected information about patients connected to special operations personnel. Not random information, targeted. The kind of information that could compromise the safety of individuals connected to classified deployments. He let that sit for exactly 1 second. Nadia Reeves, Commander Reeves's daughter, was not in a random car accident this morning. We have preliminary evidence suggesting her location was known to someone who should not have known it. Her location came from here. The silence in the ER was total. Then Holt said, "That's a serious allegation." Wren looked at him. "It's not an allegation at this stage. It's a finding." He looked back at Mara. "I'm telling you this because I need to understand the full picture of what happened in that trauma bay this morning. Who had access to the incoming patient information? Who made contact with the patient prior to arrival? Who knew she was coming?" Mara said, "The patient information came over the radio at approximately 10:20. I was in the OBS wing. I heard it from there. Did anyone have information before the radio call? You'd need to check the dispatch logs. I don't know what came in before I heard it. We're pulling those now." Wren reached inside his jacket and produced a card, standard white, and held it out to her. "I'm going to need a formal statement. Everything you observed from the moment you heard the call to the moment the patient went to the OR. Every person who was present in that bay. Every communication you saw happen." She took the card. "One more thing," he said. "Atlas." He looked at the dog. "He hasn't left your side." "No." JSOC working dogs are trained to transfer protective attachment in specific circumstances. It's a protocol built into their programming. He was watching the dog now, not her. Atlas is exhibiting attachment transfer behavior, which means that at some point, in some context that isn't in any record I have access to, you and this dog have an established relationship. Mara said nothing. "I'm not going to push that right now," Wren said, "but I want you to know that I see it." He nodded once, adjusted his jacket, and turned to speak quietly to one of the men behind him. The conversation at the nursing station was apparently over, or at least this portion of it. His team began moving, spreading out in directions that looked casual and weren't, the way trained people dispersed through a space they were systematically assessing. Mara stood where she was. The card was in her hand. Atlas was at her left leg. Holt was still 6 feet away. She looked at him. He looked like a man working through something he hadn't anticipated, not guilty. She noted that, filed it, reserved judgment on what it meant, just recalibrating. The same expression Diane had worn upstairs, but with a different quality to it. Diane's recalibration had been open, the kind that means I'm updating my understanding. Holt's had something else in it, something careful, something that was working very hard to look unconcerned. "Serious business," he said. His voice was steady. "Apparently," she said. He looked at the card in her hand. "What did he tell you? Exactly." "The same thing he'll tell you when he gets to you." She put the card in her scrub pocket. "There's an investigation. They need statements." "Right." He nodded. "Right." He was quiet for a moment. "The patient, did you see who had her chart before she came in? Any of the dispatch paperwork? I want to make sure we're giving them complete information." Mara looked at him for a moment. "That's an odd question, Russell." She never used his first name. It wasn't hostility. It was just that she'd always defaulted to professional forms of address. She wasn't sure why she used it now, except that she noticed him notice it, and that seemed like information. "Standard operational curiosity," he said. "If there's been a breach, I want to know where it came from." "I'm sure the investigators will figure it out," she said. "That's what they're here for." She walked away from him. Not fast, not pointed. The way she walked everywhere, with the unhurried directness of a person who knew exactly where she was going, which was back to the OBS wing because she had patients there and they needed her more than this hallway did right now. Atlas walked with her. She made it to the elevator, pressed the call button, and stood waiting. She was aware of Holt behind her, still at the nursing station, aware of the way he hadn't moved to go speak with Wren the way a person with nothing on their conscience would have. She was also aware of Torres across the floor, watching with her arms crossed and her eyes doing the calculation that smart residents did when they were standing at the edge of something they didn't yet understand. The elevator opened. She stepped in. The doors were closing when Wren appeared at the edge of her vision, not moving toward her, just watching. She met his eyes for the half-second available before the doors sealed shut, and in that half-second she saw the thing she'd been looking for since she'd walked off the elevator and first looked at his face. He knew. Not everything. But enough. Enough that the conversation they'd just had was not an introduction, but a confirmation. He'd come here with a name already in mind, and he'd spent the last 10 minutes verifying that the name and the woman in blue scrubs were the same person. The elevator moved. Atlas sat against her leg and exhaled through his nose, a long, slow breath, the particular sound a working dog makes when it has completed an assessment and found the situation manageable. She scratched behind his ear once. Quick. Professional. He leaned into it for exactly 1 second and then straightened back up. She had 4 hours left on her shift. She spent them working. It was the only thing she knew how to do with the particular quality of waiting that this kind of situation required. Keep moving. Keep your hands on something real. Keep the people in front of you at the center of your attention and everything else at the periphery where you could monitor it without letting it run. She checked vitals. She updated charts. She spoke with the resident about the patient in room 12, who had developed a more concerning fever pattern by mid-afternoon and needed a broader workup. And she was right about that too. And when Parrish ordered the labs an hour later because he'd finally looked at the trend data himself, she wrote it in the chart and moved on. Carver came by twice. The second time she brought coffee, from a vending machine, not the broken break room machine, which meant she'd gone out of her way, and she set it on the workstation near Mara without comment and stood for a moment. "They pulled Holt's computer," she said quietly. Mara wrapped her hands around the cup. "When?" "About 40 minutes ago." Wren's people came up with a laptop case, and they went into Holt's office and came out with his desktop unit. Holt was there. He watched them take it. She paused. He didn't say anything. He just watched. Mara thought about his face at the nursing station, the careful quality of his recalibration, the question about the dispatch paperwork that was shaped wrong. "Okay," she said. "That's the second time today you've said okay to something that doesn't sound okay." "The patients need looking after," Mara said. "The investigators are going to do what investigators do. Those are two separate jobs." Carver stared at her. "You know what I keep thinking about?" She leaned against the wall. "The Reyes patient, yesterday, the one Holt dismissed you on." Mara looked up from the coffee. "I went back and pulled the afternoon rhythm strips after you mentioned the QRS widening," Carver said. "I looked at them myself. You were right. There was widening." She folded her arms. "Holt looked at the same strip and told you it was nothing." "Either he missed it, or he didn't miss it," Mara said. Carver nodded slowly. "The Reyes patient. Is that name in the system? Family name, I mean." "It would be. If someone with a family member who was ever treated here was connected to a special operations unit, and if someone was building a way to identify and locate..." She stopped. "I don't know. I don't have enough information. But the investigators might." "The investigators might," Mara agreed. Carver was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who are you, actually?" Mara drank the vending machine coffee, which was terrible, and thought about the question and decided that the honest answer and the safe answer were both the same one, for different reasons. "I'm a nurse," she said. "Who've you got in room 13 that needs checking?" Carver almost laughed. Almost. She pushed off the wall and led the way to room 13, and Mara followed her, and Atlas followed Mara, and the afternoon ground forward the way hospital afternoons do, in increments of need and response, one patient at a time, the outside world continuing its business at the edge of attention. At 4:50, with 10 minutes left on her shift, Mara was at the OBS wing workstation finishing her final notes when she heard the elevator open, and she knew, before she looked up, that it wasn't Carver or Parrish or Diane. She knew it the way she'd known things in the dark, years ago. in places where knowing things before they happened was the difference between a clean outcome and a different kind of story. She looked up. The man who stepped off the elevator was not Ren. He was taller than Ren, broad across the shoulders, wearing the same civilian-adjacent clothes as Ren's team, but wearing them differently. The way a person wears clothes that belong to a role they've been performing long enough that the seams show. He was around 50, dark-haired with gray coming in at the temples, and he walked with the particular economy of motion that said, "Special operations to anyone who'd spent time around it." Behind him were two others, similarly built, similarly quiet. He scanned the obs wing in one sweep. His eyes found Mara. He stopped. Atlas stood up from where he'd been lying beside the workstation. Not aggressive, not on alert. The opposite. The dog's whole body changed quality, the way a person's body changes when they see someone they were not expecting to see, and the surprise is good and complicated and painful all at once. Atlas made a sound Mara had not heard it make before. A single, low vocalization, something between a whine and a word, and it walked toward the man with its tail moving in a slow, deliberate arc that was nothing like the controlled behavior it had shown all day. The man crouched down. He put both hands on the dog's face and pressed his forehead briefly against the top of its head, and then straightened back up, and his eyes were wet in the way men's eyes get when they're not going to let them be more than wet. He looked at Mara. "He picked you," he said. His voice was rough in the way voices get when they've been held steady through something difficult and are only now being allowed to relax. "He knew what he was doing," she said. "He always does." The man straightened fully and stood in front of her, and there was something in his face that was working through several different things at once. Recognition. Something older than recognition. Something she'd seen in people's faces before, in the after of difficult situations, when the crisis resolves and the people involved have to figure out how to be in each other's presence now that it's over. "You saved her," he said. "My daughter." Mara held his gaze. "Your daughter's surgeons saved her." "You got her to them," he paused. "And you held it together before that, in the bay, when nobody else could get close." She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the situation wasn't already saying. "I'm Garrett Reeves," he said. "Commander, JSOC." "I know," she said. And then, because it was the only thing that felt true right now, "I'm glad she's going to be okay." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression. Not shock, not disbelief, but something more complicated than either. The look of a man reassembling a picture he thought he understood and finding that a piece he hadn't known was missing had just been returned. "I was told," he said carefully, "that the nurse who stabilized Nadia used a classified JSOC working dog command, a Tier 1 command." He paused. "I was told the nurse's name is Mara Solis." "That's right. That's not the name I knew you by," he said. The obs wing was empty except for the three of them and Atlas and the two men behind Reeves who had gone very still. "No," Mara said. "It isn't." He nodded, slowly. The nod of a man who is receiving confirmation of something he'd suspected for the last 4 hours and is still working out how he feels about all of it. "How long have you been here?" 3 years. 3 years, he exhaled. "In Denton Falls." "It's a good hospital. Mostly." "Mostly," he repeated, and something in his face shifted toward the thing it had been working around this whole time, the thing that was waiting behind the professional composure and the controlled emotion and the relief about his daughter. "We need to talk. Not here." He glanced toward the elevator, then back. "But before we do, I want you to know that whatever happened, whatever you decided, wherever you went, what you did today was—" "You don't have to," she said. "I know I don't." He held her gaze. "I'm going to anyway." Downstairs, somewhere below them in the building's east wing, a door opened and Mara heard, distantly, through 2 floors of concrete and insulation and the ambient sound of a working hospital, raised voices. Not patient voices, not family voices. The particular register of men in an institutional confrontation, where one side has authority and is asserting it, and the other side is pushing back in the way people push back when they've decided they have nothing left to lose, or when they've calculated that they do and are trying to protect it. Atlas turned toward the elevator. Reeves's two men exchanged a look. One of them touched the radio at his collar and listened to something Mara couldn't hear, and his face changed into the flat, settled expression of someone who has just received information that confirms what they already expected. He looked at Reeves. "Sir, they have him." Reeves turned back to Mara, and in his eyes she saw the answer to the question she hadn't asked yet, hadn't let herself ask yet, because she'd needed to get through the shift, because there were patients who needed her, because she'd learned a long time ago that the thing you most want to know is usually the thing you have to wait the longest to hear. "Holt," she said. "Holt," he confirmed. The word landed in the ob's wing and stayed there. "Holt." Mara said it, and Reeves confirmed it, and then neither of them said anything else for a moment, because there are things that feel inevitable in retrospect, things where, once you know the answer, the shape of everything leading up to it rearranges itself so cleanly that you can't understand how you didn't see it coming. And this was one of those things, and both of them were in the middle of that rearrangement. The man at Reeves's collar radio listened again, nodded, said, "Copy," in the quiet shorthand of people for whom radio communication is a native language, and looked at his commander. "They've got him in the administrative conference room on 3. Wren's running it." Reeves looked at Mara. "I need to be down there." "Go," she said. "You should be there too." She started to say something about finishing her chart notes, and he stopped her with a look. Not commanding, not demanding, just the look of a man who understood something she was doing and was choosing to name it. The same look she'd given Torres that morning when the resident had wanted to push back on Holt, and Mara had said, "Not worth it." Sometimes you recognized a behavior because you'd invented it. "Mara," he said, quietly. She saved the chart she'd been working on. She stood up. "All right." They took the elevator. Reeves's two men fell in around them with the practiced ease of people who moved in protective configurations without announcing it, and Atlas stayed at Mara's left side as though he'd been given a specific instruction to do so, which in some sense, years ago, and in a different context, he had. The elevator moved. Nobody spoke. The third floor at Harlow Cross was administrative territory. Offices, conference rooms, a medical records department that was technically on this floor, but functionally accessed by a separate stairwell. The elevator opened onto a corridor that was carpeted, which always felt wrong to Mara, like walking into a building inside a building. The ER was concrete and linoleum and the smell of clean surfaces. Up here it smelled like paper and recycled air. The conference room was at the end of the hall. Its glass walls had been covered with the rolling whiteboard panels that were usually used for department planning sessions, which meant someone had made a decision about what the people in the hallway should and shouldn't be able to see. Outside the door, two of Wren's team members stood in the hallway with the particular quality of stillness that meant they were working. One of them saw Reeves and opened the door. The conference room was medium-sized, 8 chairs around a rectangular table, with a credenza along one wall and a large monitor that was currently displaying a dense array of access logs, columns of timestamps, user credentials, file identifiers, the visual language of a data forensics review. Wren was standing at the head of the table. Across from him, not sitting, was Holt. He was standing with his arms crossed and his weight shifted slightly back, the posture of a man who had decided that the correct response to this situation was controlled indignation. The indignation was real. The control was slipping. He saw Mara come in behind Reeves and something moved through his face, fast, there and gone. That wasn't indignation at all. She noted it, filed it, stood near the door. "Commander Reeves," Wren said. "Thank you for coming up." He said it the way investigators said things to people with significant institutional authority. Respectful, formal, but with the underlying clarity that this was Wren's room and Wren's process. "Where are we?" Reeves said. Not a question. Dr. Holt has been informed of the scope of the investigation and has been presented with the preliminary forensic findings. Wren gestured toward the monitor. What you're seeing there is a 72-hour sample of unauthorized access events tied to Dr. Holt's user credentials. The full dataset covers 8 months. "I want my attorney," Holt said. "You're entitled to one," Wren said. You're not under arrest at this moment, Dr. Holt. You're being interviewed. Your attorney can be present for the formal federal interview, which will happen at a later time and location. Right now, I'm giving you an opportunity to provide context. Context, Holt's voice was very controlled. You've taken my computer, you've been through my office, you've had your people talking to my staff for the last 4 hours, and you're calling that an interview. I'm calling it a conversation, Wren said, with the patient precision of a man who had done this before and understood that people in this position needed a moment to locate themselves. What you call it is up to you. Reeves moved around the table to look at the monitor more closely. He studied the access logs for a long time. Not the way an administrator looks at data, the way someone reads a language they've known for years but haven't seen written in a while. His jaw was set. The Nadia Reeves patient flag, he said. When did that go in? 6 weeks ago, Wren said. Doctor. Holt accessed her admission record from 2 years prior. A minor procedure, nothing classified. But the name association triggered a secondary flag in our monitoring system because of her connection to your service record. The access itself would have been ignorable. What wasn't ignorable was the external communication that followed within 4 hours of that access. What kind of communication? Wren pulled up a second window on the monitor. Mara could see fragments of it from across the room, encrypted message headers, partial text that had been decrypted, timestamps that ran through the night 2 days ago. Encrypted messaging, third-party application. The decryption took time because the application uses rotating keys. He pointed to a highlighted line. That communication contained your daughter's current address, a residential address she'd been at for 3 weeks, and that had not been shared publicly. The room was very quiet. Reeves straightened. He turned to look at Holt with the expression of a man who is applying a very specific discipline to himself. The discipline of people who have been trained not to act on what they're feeling in the moment they're feeling it, because acting on it creates outcomes that compromise the objective. Holt's arms were still crossed, his weight was still back, but his face had changed. The indignation had burned through its fuel. I didn't know what they were going to do with it, he said. His voice had shifted registers. Lower, less controlled, the voice underneath the one he used for the ER floor. I want to be clear about that. I provided information. I didn't have operational details. Russell? Reeves' voice, flat, controlled, the kind of flat that's a long way from calm. Holt looked at him. I didn't know about Nadia. You knew your information was going to people who asked for it in encrypted communications on a burner application. You knew that much. I knew it was sensitive, yes. I knew they were connected to adversarial. He stopped, restarted. I was told it was being used for competitive intelligence, medical liability research. I know how that sounds. It sounds like the thing people say when they want to believe the framework they were given rather than the obvious alternative, Wren said. Evenly, not cruelly. The observation of a man who had heard a lot of explanations. What were you paid? Holt didn't answer immediately. The delay itself was the answer. Russell. Reeves again. Consulting fees, Holt said. Structured as legitimate medical consulting through a third-party LLC. I thought I had insulation. The word insulation sat in the room like something that had been said in the wrong context, and everyone knew it. Mara was standing near the door, and she was thinking about the Reyes patient and the QRS intervals, and the way Holt had looked at her yesterday morning when she'd flagged the pattern. Not dismissal exactly, or not only dismissal. The other thing underneath it, the way he'd moved her off that case, the way she'd been assigned to the OBS wing for 3 weeks running, which meant she was away from charts with names that might trigger his monitoring, away from conversations that might surface information he wanted to control, away from the main ER floor where she might notice things. He hadn't been dismissing her because she was a nurse and he was a doctor. He'd been managing her proximity. She didn't say this aloud. The investigators would get there. Reeves turned from the monitor. He looked at Wren. My daughter. She's stable. I spoke with her surgical team 40 minutes ago. Someone knew where she was because of... He stopped. A controlled stop. Then, was it targeted? Was the accident? We're investigating the incident as a potential deliberate act, Wren said. We don't have confirmation yet. The vehicle that hit hers was reported stolen 2 days ago. The driver fled the scene. We have a partial plate and we're working on surveillance footage. He paused. I want to be direct with you, Commander. We don't know yet whether Nadia was targeted specifically or whether she was collateral. Someone trying to send a message, complicate your deployment, apply pressure. Those are different scenarios with different threat pictures. Reeves absorbed this. He had the face of a man absorbing something that is genuinely terrible and choosing not to let it become the dominant thing in the room, because the room required something from him that wasn't grief. What do you need from me? He said. Your formal statement about any prior interactions with Dr. Holt, any instances where he may have had access to information about your family through legitimate clinical channels. Wren looked at his folder. And your authorization to expand the records review to the full patient population connected to special operations personnel treated at this facility over the last 2 years. You have it. Thank you. Wren looked at Holt. Dr. Holt, I'm going to ask you to surrender your hospital credentials and remain available. You will not access any hospital system or contact any hospital personnel about the content of this conversation. A formal federal interview will be scheduled within 48 hours. Do you understand? Holt looked at the table. Yes. Is there anything you'd like to say before we close this portion? A long pause. Then Holt looked up, and he looked at Mara, and what was on his face was not something she'd seen from him before. It wasn't guilt exactly. Or not only guilt, it was the expression of a man who was adding things up and arriving at a sum he hadn't expected. She'd been an obstacle to manage. She'd ended up being the person who stabilized the patient he'd helped put in danger. The math of that was sitting on him. He said, I was wrong. About a lot of things. Not to Wren, to her. She didn't answer. She didn't look away either. He looked back at the table. Wren nodded to the 2 team members near the door, who moved toward Holt, not aggressively but clearly, beginning the process of walking him through the next steps. Mara moved to the side to let them pass, and the room began its reorganization, the way rooms do when the central confrontation has completed and the work of consequence is beginning. Reeves appeared at her side. He looked tired in a way that hadn't been visible before, the kind of tired that a situation holds back until the adrenaline releases. Come with me, he said. I need to see my daughter. The recovery unit was on the 5th floor. They took the elevator with Atlas and one of Reeves's men, the other having stayed on 3 with Wren's team, and the elevator moved in silence that was different from the earlier silence, less pressured, more saturated with things that hadn't been said yet and weren't going to be said in an elevator. Nadia Reeves was in a private room at the end of the recovery corridor. The nursing staff outside her room had been briefed on the situation, which meant they stepped back when Reeves appeared without being asked to, and without making a production of it. Someone had clearly done the quiet work of making this section of the floor orderly, and Mara noted with a distant professional approval that Nadia's monitoring setup was correct, and her IV lines were placed well, and her vitals on the bedside monitor were trending in the right direction. She stayed in the doorway while Reeves went to his daughter's bedside. Nadia was conscious, barely, floating in the particular shallow awareness of someone in the immediate post-anesthesia period where the world exists but is very far away. She was young. Mara had known that from the chart, 23, but seeing her in person was different. She had Reeves's coloring and a face that was very still in sleep, the way young faces are still when the body is doing significant work. There was a bruise spreading along her left jaw from the impact. Her left arm was in a brace. The surgical site was under the hospital gown, but Mara had run the numbers on her blood loss and the repair, and she knew what was under there. Reeves took his daughter's hand and said her name quietly, and she turned her head toward his voice without opening her eyes, and he said something else, too quiet for Mara to hear from the doorway, and Nadia's hand moved in his. Atlas sat down beside Mara's leg. The dog looked at the room and then looked up at Mara, and there was something in the animal's expression, and she knew perfectly well that reading expression into a dog's face was projection. She'd been told that by 3 separate people at 3 separate points in her life, and she disagreed with all 3 of them. That was close to the thing humans looked like when they were carrying something heavy and had found somewhere safe to set it down for a moment. She scratched behind his ear. He leaned into it. Reeves came back to the doorway after a few minutes. His eyes were dry. Whatever he'd done in there with the weight of the last several hours, he'd done it in those few minutes, and he'd set it down somewhere and come back functional. She understood that discipline precisely. "She's going to be angry with me," he said. "For the deployment?" "For all of it." He looked back through the door at his daughter. "She's been angry with me for 3 years. The job, the absence. The classified nature of the absence, which is the worst part. I can't explain what I'm doing or why, just that I'm doing it and I'll be back and I'm sorry it's this way." He paused. "She stopped calling for a while. Started back up 8 months ago. He stopped. "We were working on it." "She'll have more time to work on it now," Mara said, "because she's going to be okay." He looked at her sideways. "That's the second time you've said that." "It keeps being true." Something moved in his face. Not a smile, but adjacent to one, the ghost of an expression that had been possible and chose not to fully arrive. He turned away from the room and faced the corridor. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I'd rather ask it here than in a room with Wren." She waited. "You've been here 3 years," he said. "Denton Falls, Harlow Cross. A level 2 trauma center that doesn't use close to the skill set that I know." He paused, chose a different phrasing. "That clearly hasn't been using your full skill set." "It's a good hospital," she said again. "You said mostly." "Every hospital has its problems." "Mara." He said her name the way he'd said it once before, with the quality of naming something specific rather than calling someone's attention. "You were a special operations combat trauma specialist with a record that doesn't exist in any database I can access with standard clearance. The program you were attached to was Tier 1. You operated in 3 theaters over 6 years. You trained working dogs for trauma response on top of your primary specialty." He looked at her directly. "You didn't just know Atlas's command word. You named the protocol that activates his attachment transfer behavior, which means you were involved in building that protocol." She said nothing. "Why are you here?" he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, the kind asked by a man who had respect for the answer even before he heard it. "Because I needed to be somewhere else," she said. It was the most honest answer she could give that was also complete. The work was." She stopped, chose words with the same care she gave to everything. "I needed a different kind of helping. Not the kind where people come to you in pieces after something's already happened that couldn't be stopped. The kind where you can actually intervene beforehand, catch things. The trauma bay is faster, but this is..." She gestured vaguely toward the OBS wing, somewhere above them. "This is more of what I needed, watching, catching things early." He considered this. "The QRS thing," he said. "Carver told me. On the drive here, she left a message for my team contact because she said she thought I should know what had been happening in that hospital before today." "Carver's thorough," Mara said. "Holt dismissed a clinical flag you raised that turned out to be correct, which may or may not connect to the broader pattern, but probably doesn't," she said. "That one's probably just arrogance. Some people are arrogant in all directions. It doesn't always have a specific cause." "Probably," he agreed. But he didn't sound convinced. They stood in the corridor for a moment in the specific quiet of a hospital that is doing its work around 2 people who are standing still in the middle of it. An orderly moved past with a medication cart. A nurse came out of a room down the hall and went to the station. The monitor at Nadia's bedside beeped at regular intervals, the regular intervals of a body doing the work of healing. "What happens now?" Mara said. "With the investigation?" "Wren's team will build the federal case. Holt's in their system now. That's not going to go away. The scope of the records review will probably turn up more names, more connections. It usually does when you pull one thread." He folded his arms. "The hospital administration is going to have a very complicated week. The board is going to have questions about how this happened. The board is going to have questions about a lot of things." He looked at her. "Including why one of the most credentialed trauma specialists they inadvertently employed was assigned to an observation wing for 3 weeks. "I'm not credentialed here," she said. "On paper, "I know what you are on paper," he said. "That's not what I said." A door opened at the far end of the corridor. Wren came through it and behind him came two of his team, and behind them came a woman Mara hadn't seen before. 50s, sharp-featured, wearing the kind of practical suit that said Senior Federal rather than Field Agent. She was carrying a tablet and moving with the confidence of someone who had been the most important person in previous rooms and expected this one to be no different. She looked at Mara when she came close enough, and her assessment was fast and complete and professional. Special Agent Lenora Marsh, Wren said to Reeves and Mara both. She's the senior investigator on the records breach case. She flew in this afternoon. I've been briefed on Dr. Holt, Marsh said. Her voice was precise without being cold. I've also been briefed on the situation this morning. The patient, the dog, the trauma bay. She looked at Mara. And on you. There seems to be a lot of briefing happening, Mara said. There's a lot to brief. Marsh held her tablet against her chest. Ms. Solis, we've been running a parallel background investigation since approximately 2 p.m. today when Agent Wren identified the credential discrepancy. Credential discrepancy, Mara repeated. Your nursing license is current and entirely legitimate. Your employment history at Harlow Cross is exactly what it appears to be. Your license prior to that, at the Millbrook Clinic in Henderson County, likewise. Marsh paused. Prior to that, the record becomes selective. There are gaps. Not gaps in the sense of missing information, but gaps in the sense of information that has been appropriately classified and is not accessible through standard investigative channels. She said it without judgment. I've seen records structured like yours before. Not often. Then you know what they mean, Mara said. I know what they usually mean. Marsh looked at Reeves, then back. I also know that pulling on a record like that can create complications for the person the record belongs to, and I want to be clear that we have no interest in complicating anything. She held Mara's gaze. What we do have interest in is your complete account of today's events, including anything you observed about Dr. Holt's behavior in the period leading up to the patient's arrival, and a formal identification of the credential you used with the working dog. The formal identification would require, I have Tier 1 clearance, Marsh said. So does Commander Reeves. What we say in this hallway stays in this hallway. Mara looked at Reeves. He was watching her without pressure, without urgency. The look of a man who understood that this was her information to give or not give, and who had the patience to wait for whatever she decided. She looked at Atlas. The dog looked back at her with the amber gold steadiness that had not changed all day. Through the trauma bay and the obs wing and the elevator and this corridor, the particular constancy of an animal that had made its assessment and saw no reason to revise it. She said, the credential is attached to a program called Redline. It was a joint development protocol, JSOC and USAMRIID, running from about 11 years ago until, she stopped, calculated, until it was discontinued 7 years ago. The working dog training component was designed to allow certified medical personnel to assume temporary handler authority in high-stress environments when the primary handler was unavailable. The command word I used is specific to that protocol and triggers a package of trained behaviors including threat assessment, reset, protective transfer, and environmental scan. Marsh was typing on her tablet. Wren was listening without moving. You were Redline certified, Marsh said. I was Redline adjacent, Mara said carefully. I worked with the program. I contributed to the medical training component. The certification was operational, not administrative. For how long? 4 years. And you retained the credential information after the program was discontinued. I retained a lot of things, Mara said. You don't surgically remove what you know. Marsh nodded slowly. She looked at her tablet. She looked back up. There's something I need to show you, she said. And I want your reaction to be your actual reaction, not the one you decide to give me after you've had time to think. She turned the tablet around. On the screen was a photograph. It had been taken in what looked like a parking structure from a high angle, probably a security camera. It showed 2 men in a conversation, one with his back to the camera, one facing it. The one facing was Holt. The timestamp in the lower corner read 4 days ago, 22:17. The man with his back to the camera was tall, broad, wearing a dark jacket. His face wasn't visible, but his right hand was visible, and on the wrist below the jacket's cuff was a small tattoo, 2 lines and an angle, the kind of minimalist mark that meant nothing out of context and everything in the right one. Mara looked at the tattoo for a long moment. Her jaw tightened, very slightly. It was the only external thing. "You recognize the mark," Marsh said. "Where did you get this?" Mara said. "Parking structure 2 blocks from this hospital. The camera is a city traffic unit. We pulled it when we started working backward from Holt's encrypted communications." Marsh took the tablet back. "The mark. What does it mean to you?" "It's a unit identifier," Mara said. "Specific unit. Foreign intelligence aligned. I've seen it before." "Where?" Mara looked at Reeves. He was very still. "Overseas," she said. 7 years ago. In the context that ended Red Line." She paused. "There were 3 casualties in the event that resulted in the program's discontinuation. 2 were personnel I'd worked alongside. 1 was—" She stopped, breathed, restarted. "1 was someone I worked with closely. For a long time." The corridor was very quiet. "That unit was connected," she said, "to that event. Tangentially, not directly. We never had proof, just a pattern. The kind of pattern that gets an investigation opened and then closed because the political cost of following it exceeds what anyone wants to pay." "The investigation was closed 7 years ago," Marsh said. "Yes." "It may not be closed anymore," Marsh said. Mara looked at her. "If the same foreign intelligence network that was associated with Red Line's end has been running a medical intelligence operation through a U.S. civilian hospital for 8 months," Marsh said, her voice precise, "and that operation targeted the daughter of a current JSOC commander using information obtained through a doctor they had cultivated, then what happened 7 years ago and what happened today in this hospital are potentially connected events." The floor seemed very stable under Mara's feet. She focused on that. "Which means," Marsh continued, "that the person standing in this corridor who has direct knowledge of both events, whose record intersects with both timelines, and who today demonstrated capabilities that are not in any civilian file." She paused. "Is not standing here by coincidence." "I've been here for 3 years," Mara said. "I know. I didn't come here because of this." "I believe you," Marsh said with the calm of a woman who'd assessed a lot of people and made the call. "But here you are anyway." Reeves said, "Mara." She looked at him. "The man in the photograph," he said. "If you can identify him, so not the mark, him specifically. I need to know." She looked back at the tablet in Marsh's hands, the parking structure, the timestamp, Holt's face, the man's back, the jacket, the wrist, the tattoo. She had seen that jacket before, the cut of it, the particular way it sat on broad shoulders, a tailored fit that was meant to look off the rack, the kind of care that went into dressing someone who needed to appear less formal than they were. She'd seen it in a different light, a different country, under different circumstances, in the last moments of a situation that had cost her more than any debrief had been capable of containing. Her voice was steady when she spoke. It was always steady. That was the thing nobody here except maybe Reeves understood, that her steadiness wasn't composure. It was something older and harder than composure. "I can identify him," she said. Marsh and Wren exchanged a look. "His operational name when I knew him was Carver," she said, and registered 2 seconds later that that was also the name of the day nurse she'd been working alongside all afternoon, which was the kind of absurd collision that happened in real situations and never in fiction because fiction tried to be tidier than life. "His real name, his actual legal name, I don't know. I was never given it. But I can tell you everything I know about him, his methods, his network, the way he recruits, the way he protects his sources." She looked at Marsh directly. "And I can tell you that if he's the one who cultivated Holt, and if Holt gave him Nadia Reeves's location, then Nadia wasn't the target." She let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. She was leverage to bring Garrett Reeves home. Reeves went very still. "If Reeves comes home from a classified deployment to manage a family crisis," Mara continued, "the deployment is compromised. Whatever operation he was running, whatever the timing was, whatever the operational window. We were 48 hours from a critical phase. Reeves said. His voice was very controlled. I had to pull out when I got the call about Nadia. I've been out of position for... He stopped, looked at Marsh. The operation is not in my hands right now. Someone else is running it. If they knew the timeline... Marsh was already on her phone. Wren was moving toward the elevator, and from down the corridor, from the direction of the nursing station near the recovery room, a door opened sharply, and one of Reeves's men came through it with the flat, certain expression of someone delivering news they wish they weren't carrying. "Sir," he said, "we've got a problem." Reeves turned. "One of the vehicles from this morning, the one that hit your daughter's car, we've got a hit on the plate. The driver." He looked at the phone in his hand. "He came into this hospital 40 minutes ago." The words hit the corridor like something physical. Came into this hospital 40 minutes ago. Nobody moved for exactly 1 second, the kind of second that exists in operational situations where everyone present is running the same calculation simultaneously, and all of them are arriving at the same answer. Then Reeves moved, and Wren moved, and Marsh was already talking into her phone with the compressed urgency of someone issuing instructions to people in multiple locations at once. "Which entrance?" Reeves said. "Emergency department. He came in as a walk-in, laceration on his right forearm." His man was reading from his phone, the information coming through in fragments as it was assembled on the other end. "Triage logged him 43 minutes ago. Name given was false. We ran it against the plate hit and it doesn't match anything." He looked up. "He's still in the building. He hasn't been discharged." "Where's he now?" "We're checking." Mara was already thinking about the emergency department layout, the triage flow, where walk-in lacerations went. Minor injuries, non-critical. They went to the fast-track section, the 6-bed annex off the main ER floor that handled low-acuity cases to keep them out of the main bays. She knew that section. She knew which rooms faced the exit corridor and which ones faced the wall, and she knew that the fast track had one entrance and one exit, and both of them fed into the same hallway. "Fast track," she said. "If he came in with a laceration, he's in fast track. Room 4 or 5, probably. Those are the ones that get assigned when the section is moving." Wren looked at her. "You know this floor. I work here." He was already gesturing to his team. 2 of them moved to the elevator. A third went for the stairwell door. Reeves looked at Mara. It was a brief look, the kind that communicates a full sentence in under a second. She read it. "Stay here." She held his gaze for a beat that communicated her own full sentence back. He almost said something, then didn't because he was already moving and the situation didn't have room for the conversation. She waited until he was in the elevator, then she went for the stairwell. Atlas came with her. She wasn't running. Running in a hospital drew attention in ways that complicated the objective, which was to move quickly without causing the kind of visible alarm that spread through a floor and changed the behavior of the person you were trying to reach before you reached him. She moved the way she moved through trauma bays, fast and direct, the motion of someone who knows where they're going and has a reason to get there that supersedes social convention but isn't an emergency. Hospital staff moved for that kind of motion without being asked. She'd watched it happen her entire career, the unconscious parting that occurred when someone moved like they meant it. 2 flights of stairs. The stairwell smelled like cleaning solution and the particular mustiness of a space that was used primarily by people who were in a hurry. Atlas's claws clicked on the concrete steps in a fast, even rhythm behind her. Ground floor. She pushed through the stairwell door into the hallway that ran parallel to the ER's east wall, turned right, moved past the radiology intake desk where a technician looked up and then looked back down, and came through the connector corridor into the fast-track annex from the back entrance. The annex was 6 beds behind curtained partitions, a nursing station in the center, and the kind of overhead lighting that made everything look slightly worse than it was. 3 of the 6 curtains were drawn. A nurse Mara didn't recognize, night staff rotating through, was charting at the station with her back to the entrance. Mara scanned the drawn curtains, rooms 2, 4, and 5. Room 4's curtain had a gap at the bottom. She could see feet. Someone lying down, 1 foot moving slightly. The restless movement of someone in mild discomfort. Not the posture of a person preparing to exit quickly. Room 5's curtain was fully closed and completely still. She moved to the nursing station. "Hey," she said, quietly enough that it didn't carry to the curtains. The nurse turned, young, maybe 26, with the slightly glazed focus of someone 2 hours into a night shift. The patient in room 5, what's his status? Laceration repair. He's waiting for the attending to check the closure. The nurse glanced at her screen. Maybe another 10 minutes. Is the attending in with him now? No, Dr. Lim finished the repair and left to check on room 2. She's coming back. Okay. Mara looked at the curtain. Don't go back in there for a few minutes. The nurse blinked. What? Trust me. She held her ID up, which was meaningless in the context she was implying, but which the nurse's brain interpreted as authority, because that's what humans do when they're uncertain and someone presents credentials with confidence. Give it a few minutes. She positioned herself at the side of the nursing station where she had a sight line to room 5's curtain and to the annex entrance simultaneously. Atlas sat at her left leg. The dog's ears were fully forward. She heard the elevator open at the end of the corridor, the sound of multiple people moving with coordinated purpose. Room 5's curtain moved. Not all the way, just a shift at the edge, the kind made by someone testing whether a space is clear before committing to movement. A person doing that was a person who had heard something they weren't comfortable with and was doing the math on their options. The curtain shifted again. Mara said clearly, at a conversational volume, "The exit corridor is covered. The main ER entrance has people at it. The ambulance bay is the same." She wasn't looking at the curtain. She was looking at the nursing station, keeping her voice even. "There's nowhere that isn't covered, and I'm standing between you and the one exit that isn't." Stillness from behind the curtain. The specific stillness of someone processing. Ren came through the annex entrance with 2 of his team, and 2 seconds behind them Reeves appeared, and they stopped when they saw Mara already positioned and Atlas already sitting at attention. "Room 5, she said, without turning. The curtain opened. The man who came out was medium height, compact, with the efficient build of someone who worked hard at not being memorable. He was 30-something, with a fresh bandage on his right forearm, and a face that had been composed into something neutral and cooperative, the face of a man who had made a professional calculation. His eyes went to Ren's credentials, to Reeves' bearing, to the configuration of people in the annex, and they moved through all of it quickly and came to rest on Mara. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Atlas. The dog was looking back at him with the absolute focus of an animal that had been trained to assess threat and had completed its assessment. The man said, "I'd like to speak with someone with federal authority." "That's me," Ren said, moving forward. "Hands where I can see them." The process after that was procedural and fast. Ren's team was thorough and professionally impersonal about it, and the man, who identified himself to Ren in a quiet exchange as Dmitri Saal, which Mara noted was almost certainly not the name on whatever passport he'd arrived with, offered no resistance. He had the manner of someone who had thought through this contingency and decided cooperation was the position with the most strategic value. Reeves stayed at the edge of the annex, watching. His face was doing the controlled thing again, but with more effort than before, because this was the person whose action had put his daughter in a hospital bed 1 floor above them, and that was a different kind of information to manage than the abstract knowledge that an operation had been compromised. Mara stepped back and let Ren's team work. The annex nurse had retreated to the far end of the station and was watching everything with her hands flat on the desk in front of her, grounding herself in something solid. Mara caught her eye and gave her the small nod that means you're okay. Just wait. And the nurse nodded back. When Saal had been walked to the annex entrance and handed off to the 2 team members outside, Ren came back to where Mara was standing. "How did you know he was still here?" he said. If his objective was to create a diversion, bring Reeves home, pull him off deployment, then he needs to know whether it worked. You don't set something like that in motion and then walk away before you know the outcome. She looked at the empty curtain of room 5. He came in for a legitimate reason, the laceration, probably got it during the incident, but he stayed. He was waiting to find out whether Reeves was actually here. Ren was quiet for a moment. "And he is. And he is." Reeves appeared at her shoulder. "Which means they knew about the hospital before today. They knew Nadia had been treated here before. They had enough information to choose this facility specifically." He said it like a man laying stones in a path, one at a time, making sure each one was solid before he stepped onto it. That's not random access, that's cultivated access. Holt's been on staff here for 11 years, Mara said. If your daughter was ever treated here in that window. She was, 4 years ago. An asthma episode when she was visiting her mother. It was minor 2-hour ER visit. He paused. I was deployed. I didn't know until afterward. 4 years ago is when the access pattern starts, Wren said. He was looking at his phone. I just got the first summary from the forensics team. The earliest flagged access event in Holt's record is 4 years and 2 months ago. A patient record pull in the system that looked administrative at the time. The three of them stood in the fast-track annex with that timeline sitting between them. The particular weight of something that had been running for 4 years under the surface of an ordinary hospital, hidden in the ordinary behavior of a doctor who had let himself be recruited so gradually that maybe he'd never located the moment when he'd crossed the line. Or maybe he had located it and had chosen to keep walking anyway. She didn't know which was true about Holt. She suspected she wouldn't know for some time, and she suspected it mattered less than the practical consequence, which was the same either way. I need to go back upstairs, Reeves said. To Nadia. Go, Wren said. Reeves looked at Mara. There was something in the look that was different from all the previous looks of the evening. Less operational, less layered with the things that couldn't be said in front of other people. Something closer to the surface. Thank you, he said. For room 5, that was procedural, she said. I know this building. He almost did the smile thing again. Almost. Yeah. He looked at Atlas. The dog looked back at him with the same amber gold steadiness. Take care of him tonight. He seems to be taking care of himself, she said. Reeves left. His footsteps were quieter than his bearing suggested, the trained quiet of someone who'd spent enough time in places where sound had consequences. The annex felt larger without him in it. Wren said, I need you to come back up to 3. There are parts of your debrief we haven't gotten to. I know. Specifically the redline connection and the operational name Carver. He paused. And specifically what you know about the network's methodology. If this is the same group that was involved in the program's discontinuation 7 years ago, then you have contextual knowledge that isn't documented anywhere I can access, and I need it documented now while this investigation is active and the threads are live. I understand. I also need to know about the 3 casualties, he said. Carefully. The way investigators say careful things, with the precision that acknowledges they're touching something that belongs to someone else. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the bandage on the annex chair that Dr. Lim had left behind when she'd repaired Saal's laceration. A flat square of gauze and tape. The ordinary material of small repairs. Upstairs, she said. Give me 10 minutes. 10 minutes. He left. She sat down in the chair at the nursing station and put her hands flat on the desk in front of her the way the night nurse had done, which she hadn't planned to do and noticed only after she'd done it. Atlas put his head on her knee. She looked at the top of his head, the close-cropped fur between his ears, the faint scar along his right ear's base that she'd noticed that morning in the trauma bay and had not let herself think about since, because the scar told her something about where he'd been after the program ended, and she hadn't been ready to think about it yet. She thought about it now. 7 years was a long time. Long enough to build something new from the rubble of something old, which she had done. Long enough to become mostly the person you decided to be rather than the one the old situation had required. Long enough that the name she went by felt like her name and not a construction most days. Most days. She put her hand on the dog's head and he didn't move. After 9 minutes, she stood up, squared herself by the necessary amount, and went upstairs. The debrief took 2 hours. Marsh ran it, with Wren taking notes, and a third agent she hadn't been introduced to operating a recording device in the corner. It was thorough in the way of people who understood the importance of what they were capturing and didn't want to have to do it twice. Mara gave them everything she had. The redline timeline, the operational context, the event 7 years ago that had ended the program, the details she could provide about the network's recruitment methodology based on what she'd seen in the field, and the 3 casualties. She described each of them with the factual precision she gave everything. And when she got to the third one, she paused for 4 seconds. She counted them, a habit, and then continued. Marsh didn't push. She noted the pause, which Mara saw her do, and she moved forward, which was the right call. When the recording stopped, Marsh looked at her across the table and said, "This changes the scope of the federal case considerably." I assumed it would. The Holt prosecution will proceed on the data breach charges regardless. That's solid, and it will hold. She tapped her tablet. But if we can establish a direct network connection, if we can link Saal to the same operational chain that was involved with Redline's end, then what Dr. Holt was part of is not an isolated influence operation. It's an ongoing foreign intelligence effort targeting U.S. Special Operations personnel through civilian medical infrastructure. Which means other hospitals, Mara said. Which means other hospitals, Marsh confirmed. Which means a significantly larger investigation. She looked at her notes. We're going to need to bring your full history into the formal record, the classified portions. She held Mara's gaze. That means your operational identity, what you were, what you did. The record that's currently structured to not exist in civilian databases is going to need to exist in this one. Mara absorbed this. What does that mean, practically? Practically, it means that the next time someone looks you up, and people will, once a federal case is filed, they're not going to find a nurse with a 3-year history and a gap before that. Marsh paused. They're going to find what you actually are. The conference room was quiet. Through the glass wall panels, the whiteboard panels had been moved at some point in the last 2 hours. Mara could see the corridor, and beyond it, the window that looked out over the hospital's east parking lot, where 2 of Wren's vehicles were still positioned and the night had fully come in, the parking lot lit in pools of orange-yellow that made the spaces between them look very dark. All right, she said. Marsh nodded once. We'll draft the authorization request tonight. It'll go up the chain. This is not a decision I can make unilaterally. I understand. It will be approved, Marsh said, with the quiet certainty of a senior investigator who knew what she was looking at. What you gave us tonight is the connective tissue for a case that's been incomplete for 7 years. The people above me who know about Redline have been waiting for something to break this open. She closed her tablet. Turns out it broke open in an ER in Denton Falls. A Level 2 trauma center, Mara said. A Level 2 trauma center, Marsh agreed, and there was something in her voice that was as close to dry humor as the situation allowed. The debrief ended. Mara walked out of the conference room at 7:40 in the evening, which was 4 hours and 40 minutes after her shift had technically ended, and stood in the carpeted third-floor corridor and felt the particular quality of exhaustion that came not from physical effort, but from sustained, controlled precision over too many hours in too high stakes a context. Atlas came out of the room beside her. He'd been given a water bowl by someone at some point during the debrief. She'd noticed it appear without seeing who brought it. And he looked better for it. She looked down at him. You need to eat, she said. He looked up at her. Me too, she said. She found a vending machine on the second floor. She got a package of crackers and a bottle of water for herself, and after a moment of staring at the options with the specific blankness of someone whose decision-making capacity was operating at reduced efficiency, a second bottle of water and a pack of peanut butter crackers that she put on the floor for the dog, who ate them with focused efficiency and then looked up at her with the expression of an animal that was not going to pretend that was adequate, but understood it was what was available. She ate her crackers in the hallway. Carver found her there. The day nurse was still in her scrubs, which meant she'd also run long, and she had a look on her face that was trying to contain too many things at once and wasn't entirely succeeding. She stopped when she saw Mara sitting against the wall in the second-floor corridor with a vending machine at her back and a military working dog beside her and crackers in her hand. I've had a very strange day, Carver said. Yes, Mara said. I want to ask you about 12 things, and I have a feeling you're not going to answer most of them. Probably not tonight. Carver sat down against the wall beside her. Not because the situation called for it, but because apparently that was the kind of person she was when the formality of the floor was no longer required. She stretched her legs out and crossed her ankles and looked at the ceiling. Holt's been suspended, she said. Administration got the notification from Wren's team about an hour ago. Dr. Yamamoto is covering the ER tonight. She paused. Diane's been with the hospital director for the last 2 hours. I don't know what that conversation looks like, but I can imagine. The hospital is going to have questions it needs to answer, Mara said. Yeah. Carver looked at her. One of the questions is about you. I know. The Ob's wing thing. 3 weeks. I should have said something earlier. It wasn't your job to say something. Still, Carver was quiet for a moment. The Reyes patient. If Holt was managing what you saw, pulling you off charts, keeping you in OBS, then the QRS thing might not have been about diagnostic arrogance. He might have been managing your access specifically. That occurred to me, Mara said, because you know things he didn't want you to know. Because I notice things, Mara said, which is different. Carver nodded slowly. She looked at Atlas. The dog looked back at her with the patient, measuring attention he gave everyone. He's been with you all day. Yes. That's not normal dog behavior. No. Carver accepted this without pushing it further, which was one of the things Mara had always appreciated about her without having consciously identified it until now. She knew when she'd reached the edge of what a conversation had to offer. They sat in the second-floor hallway and ate vending machine crackers and didn't talk for a few minutes, and it was the most ordinary thing that had happened since 10:20 that morning. Then Mara's phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be Ren, which meant someone had given him her number, which was mildly irritating and also completely expected given the day. The text said, "Administration is requesting your presence tomorrow morning, 800. Director Halloran's office. I'll be there. Reeves will be there. Hospital Legal will be there." She read it twice. Then she read it again. Carver looked at her sideways. What? Tomorrow morning, Mara said. What happens tomorrow morning? She put her phone in her scrub pocket and looked at the ceiling the way Carver had been doing earlier. The second-floor corridor of Harlow Cross Medical Center. Linoleum and fluorescent light and the distant ambient sound of a hospital that never fully stopped. She'd spent 3 years walking these halls. 3 years of being the nurse in the OBS wing with the quiet hands and the careful eyes and the instinct she wasn't supposed to have. 3 years of Holt's dismissals and Diane's calibrations and patients who got better because she caught things early, and all of it had been moving, she understood now, toward a morning she hadn't planned for and a room she hadn't imagined sitting in. A conversation, she said. About? Everything, she said. Carver was quiet. Then, are you going to be okay? It was such a human question, not tactical, not procedural, just the plain question one person asked another at the end of a hard day. Mara looked at her and felt something that wasn't quite warm, but was in the vicinity of warm. The way things near a fire are warm even when they're not in it. Probably, she said. It wasn't the most reassuring answer. Carver accepted it anyway. Mara stood up, collected the empty wrappers, dropped them in the trash, and straightened her scrub top. Atlas stood with her. She looked at the corridor ahead, the elevator at one end and the stairwell at the other, the ordinary infrastructure of a building she'd spent 3 years learning to move through. She thought about the man called Carver, the operational name, not the day nurse who was sitting at her feet currently, and the jacket and the tattoo and the parking structure and 4 years of data pulled from records that should have been private. She thought about Holt in the conference room, his arms crossed and his indignation burning through its fuel. She thought about Saal in Fast Track, making the professional calculation that cooperation was his best position. And she thought about something else, a detail that had been sitting at the back of her mind since Marsh's debrief, since the moment when Marsh had said the network's methodology and she'd started explaining it and had noticed, midway through the explanation, a gap. The gap was small, the kind that didn't show up unless you knew the shape of what was supposed to be there. Holt had been cultivated for 4 years. Saal had been present in the city. The operation had the infrastructure of something maintained and supported from a distance. Not improvised, not responsive, but planned. Maintained. Maintained operations required local support. Not just the contact at the top, not just the recruited asset at the bottom. Something in the middle. Someone who ensured the maintenance, who kept the channel clear, who ensured that Holt had what he needed, that the data moved correctly, that the infrastructure held. Holt had worked at Harlow Cross for 11 years. 11 years. The first access event in his record was 4 years ago, which meant someone had been watching him for longer than 4 years before deciding he was worth cultivating, which meant someone had been present and watching during a window that predated the investigation, which meant her phone buzzed again. Not Ren this time. A number she actually recognized, the hospital's internal system, generating an automated notification from the patient records department. It was a standard notification, the kind generated when a patient record was accessed. Specifically, when a patient record was accessed from a workstation that was logged into an active staff account. The record accessed was Nadia Reeves. The staff account was one she recognized. It belonged to a member of the hospital's administrative staff who had been employed at Harlow Cross for 9 years, who had quiet access to every patient's intake record as part of their legitimate administrative function, and who had been sitting 2 floors below the recovery room where Nadia Reeves was sleeping under guard, with access to the hospital's full network all evening. Mara looked at the notification. She looked at Carver. "The administration contact," she said. "The person who routes intake records for billing. What's her name? The one who's been here about 9 years, dark hair, works evenings." Carver frowned. "Renata Voss?" Mara was already moving. Carver was still on the floor saying something behind her, but Mara was already at the stairwell door, moving, not running. Not yet. The stairwell door closed behind her and Atlas's claws hit the concrete steps, and she took them fast, one flight down to the ground floor, and she was thinking while she moved, the kind of thinking that happens in parallel with the body's work, the kind she'd learned in contexts where stopping to think was the same as stopping to die. Renata Voss, 9 years, administrative staff, billing intake access, which meant she had legitimate, daily, unremarkable contact with every patient record that moved through Harlow Cross. Intake data, insurance verification, identity confirmation. The kind of access that generated no flags because it was supposed to exist. The kind of position that a well-run intelligence operation would identify as the perfect maintenance point. Not the recruited asset, who was always the vulnerable link, but the infrastructure. The person who ensured the channel worked. Who could look at a record without it registering as unusual, who had been there for 9 years, 5 of which preceded Holt's recruitment, long enough to have identified him as a candidate before anyone made the approach. The stairwell door opened onto the ground floor's service corridor, and Mara turned left toward the administrative wing. She was calling Ren while she walked. He picked up on the second ring. "Voss?" she said. "Renata Voss. Administrative billing. She just accessed Nadia Reeves' intake record from a workstation. I got a system notification." A brief pause. The sound of Ren already moving. "Where is she?" "Administrative wing, ground floor, if she's at her workstation. I'm 30 seconds out." "Don't go in alone." "I'm not going in anywhere. I just need to know if she's still there before she isn't." She came around the corner into the administrative corridor and slowed to the unhurried directness that meant business without broadcasting alarm. "I'll stay on the line." The administrative wing at night was quieter than the clinical floors. Lower lighting in the waiting areas, the particular hush of a section of the building where the work was paper-based, and most of it happened between 8 and 5. The billing department was a suite of 4 offices and an open bullpen behind a frosted glass partition. The partition's lights were on. Mara stopped at the corridor junction 20 feet from the partition door and looked through the frosted glass. One figure at a workstation, dark hair, the posture of someone in the middle of a task, leaning slightly forward, hands on a keyboard. "She's here," Mara said quietly. Billing bullpen, still at the computer. "I've got 2 people 30 seconds from your position," Ren said. "Hold." She held. She stood at the corridor junction with Atlas sitting at her left knee and watched the frosted glass partition and kept the phone to her ear, and she thought about the thing she hadn't said to Ren yet, the thing that had been assembling itself since the debrief, since Marcia's timeline, since the notification that had arrived on her phone with the quiet precision of a system doing its job correctly even when the humans around it were not. 4 years of Holt, 9 years of Voss. The operation had been running in this building for nearly a decade, at a frequency and patience that said something about the people who designed it. This wasn't improvised. It wasn't opportunistic in the way that most security compromises were opportunistic. A disgruntled employee, a financial pressure, a moment of bad judgment. This had been planned from a starting position that required knowing, years in advance, what kind of access would be valuable and where to build it. That level of planning required someone who understood American civilian medical infrastructure, who knew what billing admin looked like from the inside, who had spent enough time adjacent to it to know which positions were invisible and which weren't. The two agents appeared at the far end of the corridor, moving fast, and Mara stepped back from the junction as they passed her. One of them glanced at her and nodded. She nodded back. They went through the partition door with the practiced efficiency of people who did this regularly, and she heard it happen, the opening, the brief exchange of voices, one voice saying federal investigators in the flat, declarative, that didn't invite response, and then a different quality of silence. Mara walked to the partition door. Renata Voss was standing beside her workstation with her hands visible and her face arranged into something that was trying to be surprise and was missing by the precise margin that told you it wasn't surprise. She was 51, which Mara hadn't known. She'd clocked her as mid-40s from their limited interactions, with the kind of face that was good at presenting a front surface that didn't invite inspection. She'd been looking at Mara for the 2 years they'd worked in the same building with the expression of someone processing a minor piece of scenery. Now she was looking at her differently. "Ms. Voss," one of the agents was saying, "we need you to step away from the workstation and come with us." "I'd like to know what this is about," Voss said. Her voice was controlled in a way that was a tell in itself. Not the controlled voice of someone shocked and trying to stay calm, but the controlled voice of someone executing a prepared position. "You accessed a patient record approximately 11 minutes ago," the agent said. "The patient is connected to an active federal investigation. Your access will be explained to you in detail when we've secured the scene." "I access patient records all day. It's my job." "Your shift ended at 6 p.m. A beat. Very small. "I was finishing some work." "We'll talk about that," the agent said. Mara looked at the workstation screen over the agent's shoulder. It had been locked. Voss had done it manually at some point in the last 30 seconds, which was itself a data point because an innocent person doesn't think to lock their screen when federal agents walk in. An innocent person is either too shocked to think about their computer or reaches for their phone. Voss had locked the screen, reflexively, quickly, as the first prioritized action. 9 years of reflexes. The agents walked her out. Mara stepped aside and watched her pass, and Voss looked at her as she went by with the specific look of someone who has just understood the mechanism of their undoing. Not the big moments, not the investigation or the forensics or the federal credentials, but the small automated thing, the system notification, the patient access flag, the kind of routine IT function that nobody thinks about because it's always been there and nobody's ever looked at it. "Mara." Ren was still on the line. "I see her," she said. "Your people have her." "Good catch," he said. "The notification? Standard system function. It flags access to records tagged in an active investigation. Someone set the Reeves intake file as a monitored record earlier today, and the system did what it was supposed to do." She paused. "I just happened to be the one looking at my phone." "Right place," he said. "Right time," she finished, which was what people said and what was true, and also not the whole truth, because right place and right time didn't account for the 3 years of learning this building's rhythms, this system's behavior, the way data moved through a hospital's administrative infrastructure. The right place and the right time meant nothing without the person standing in them who knew what she was looking at. She didn't say any of that to Ren. She ended the call, put her phone in her pocket, and stood alone in the billing department's open bullpen with Atlas at her feet and the locked workstation glowing faintly in front of her. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere in the building above them, a door opened and closed. The hospital's ambient sound moved through the walls. She was very tired. Not the sharp-edged tired of a long shift. The deep tired that lived underneath everything and only became audible when the external noise finally stopped. The tired that comes from years of a particular kind of vigilance that you maintain so consistently you stop registering it as effort. She looked at the locked screen for a moment. Then she turned and walked out. The meeting in Director Halloran's office the next morning was scheduled for 8 and started at 8:03, which was the kind of precision that said the people in the room took each other seriously. Mara arrived at 7:58 and was the second person there after Wren, who was already at the conference table with a folder and the focused, slightly tired look of a man who'd been awake most of the night building a case file. "Voss," he said when she sat down, "what did you find?" Her real employment history goes back farther than 9 years. Different name, different facilities, same methodology. We found 2 prior placements, a regional hospital in New Mexico, 4 years, a private clinic network in Virginia, 3 years. Both facilities had documented security incidents during her employment that were attributed to other causes at the time. He opened the folder. She was recruited through a mechanism we're still pulling apart, but the initial contact appears to trace to the same network as the Saal connection. Same operational chain, different function. Saal was action. Voss was infrastructure. How long before you can move on the larger network? Weeks, maybe less, given what you gave us last night. He looked at her. Your red line debrief connects 3 previously unlinked incidents across 2 continents. The case team that reviewed it overnight, the senior analysts, they want to talk to you directly. I assumed. It's going to mean more conversations, more formal record-making. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in a different register, how are you doing? It was the second time in 12 hours someone had asked her a version of that question, and both times it had arrived from an unexpected direction. She considered giving him the probably she'd given Carver, and decided he deserved something more precise. I'm functional, she said, which is what I need to be right now. That's a nurse answer, he said. I'm a nurse, she said. He almost smiled. Right. Director Halloran arrived at 8:01, followed by the hospital's legal counsel, a trim man named Ferris, who had the careful energy of someone who had been briefed on the situation in summary form and was operating from the edges of his comprehension while trying not to show it. Behind them came Reeves, still in yesterday's clothes, but with the settled quality of a man who'd gotten at least a few hours of sleep and had used them correctly. Behind Reeves was Marsh. And behind Marsh, last through the door, came Diane. Mara hadn't expected Diane. Diane sat across from her and met her eyes and gave her a nod that contained, in the compressed language of people who work closely enough to communicate without words, something that was part apology and part acknowledgement, and part something she didn't have a precise word for. The nod of a woman who had been doing her job correctly for 14 years, and had been sitting 3 floors below a situation she hadn't known was a situation, and was now in a room trying to figure out what her role was and what came next. Halloran opened the meeting with the brisk efficiency of a hospital director who had been awake since 4 a.m., receiving information, and had processed it into a position. He was a tall man, gray-haired, with the kind of administrative authority that came from 20 years of running a large institution and knowing exactly what his job was and was not. I'll be direct, he said, looking at Mara. The hospital is cooperating fully with the federal investigation. Dr. Holt has been suspended with immediate effect. Ms. Voss has been administratively separated, and her access to all systems has been revoked as of 11:47 last night. We are conducting an internal audit of all patient records access going back 5 years, and we will be reporting those findings to Agent Wren's team as they develop. He paused. That's the institutional position. What I need to address now, with you specifically, is what happened in this hospital yesterday, and what it tells us about this hospital's failures. Mara waited. You identified a clinical concern on a patient that Dr. Holt dismissed, Halloran said. That concern was later validated. You responded to an incoming trauma patient with capabilities significantly beyond your documented scope, stabilized her, and got her to surgery in time to save her life. You identified a security threat in fast track when trained federal personnel were still locating the individual. And you identified a second breach point through a routine system notification that our own security team hadn't flagged. He looked at her directly. You did all of this as a nurse assigned to a 3-bed observation wing. The obs wing patients needed attention too, Mara said. Halloran looked at her for a moment. I'm told you said that without irony. I meant it without irony. Something moved in his face that was close to the expression Reeves had worn twice yesterday, the thing adjacent to a smile that didn't fully arrive. Ms. Solis, I've been informed in broad terms of the background that Agent Wren's investigation has surfaced. I don't have clearance for specifics. I don't need them. He folded his hands on the table. What I have is a significant failure on the part of this institution. Specifically, the failure to recognize and utilize the skills of a member of our staff, and a corresponding responsibility to address it. Ferris, the legal counsel, opened his mouth. Halloran looked at him. Ferris closed it. I'd like to offer you a role on this hospital's trauma team, Halloran said. Not observation, not a support position. Senior trauma nursing with an additional mandate, which we're still drafting the structure for, around emergency response training. Your methods in that trauma bay yesterday morning were documented by 4 nurses and a respiratory tech. Multiple staff members have formally requested that those methods be incorporated into our training program. He paused. Diane has been advocating for this since 6 a.m. Mara looked at Diane. Diane looked back at her with the steady expression of a woman who had made a decision and was done apologizing for having needed time to make it. I should have been paying better attention, Diane said. For a while now. You were working with the information you had, Mara said. I was working with the information I let myself have, Diane said. That's different. It was. Mara didn't argue it. Reeves spoke for the first time since entering the room. He'd been sitting with his forearms on the table listening, in the specific stillness of a man letting other people's processes complete before he added his. The military would also like to acknowledge your role officially, he said, not in a public record way. Some of what's involved isn't going to surface in public documentation, but there will be a formal commendation. The Red Line program, its personnel, and the events of 7 years ago are going to get a second review as part of the expanded investigation. That's not nothing. She looked at him. It's not about commendations. I know, he said. That's why I'm telling you, because it's not going to feel like what you deserve. It's going to feel like bureaucracy catching up to something that already happened and issuing paperwork about it. I want you to know that the people who understand what you actually did, what you've been doing for years, in places that didn't have any obligation to recognize it, know. Even when the paperwork doesn't say it clearly. The conference room was quiet. Mara looked at the table. She thought about the 3 casualties she'd described to Marsh in the debrief the night before, the 4 seconds she'd paused, the way she'd restarted and kept going. She thought about the OBS wing and the 3 patients who'd needed medication checks while federal investigators were in her hospital pulling computers out of offices. She thought about vending machine crackers and a dog's head on her knee and Carver sitting on the second-floor hallway floor, because apparently that was just who Carver was. She thought about the QRS intervals on the afternoon strip of a patient nobody was watching, and the fact that she had watched, and the fact that watching was the thing she had come here to do, specifically and deliberately, because it was the version of the work that fit the shape of what she had left to give. She thought about how the thing you needed to do and the thing you ended up doing were almost never the same thing, and how the gap between them was where most of the actual living happened. All right, she said. Halloran nodded. We'll have the formal offer in writing by end of day. The training component, she said. I want input on the structure, what I do in a trauma bay. It's not procedural in the way that most training is procedural. It's contextual. It requires people to understand why, not just what. That's exactly why we want you to design it, Halloran said. It's also going to require resources, equipment, time, staff buy-in. Some of what I teach is going to push against people's assumptions about their roles. Push, he said. We'll manage the friction. Mara looked at Diane. Diane said, I'll manage the friction. And that was that. The meeting ended at 8:51. People collected their folders and their phones and began the reorganization of a room after a decision, the particular movement of people who have completed something and are turning back toward the next thing. Wren stopped beside her on the way out. Formal interviews with the case team, he said. This week, if possible. Tell me when. He nodded. He left. Reeves was the last one out, or almost. He paused at the door and looked back at her. Nadia wants to meet you, he said, when she's more awake. She asked who the nurse was. From the trauma bay. I didn't do anything in the trauma bay that any qualified nurse, Mara. She stopped. "Let her say thank you," he said. "She needs to, and you should let someone." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, "Okay." He left. The door closed behind him. She sat alone in Halloran's conference room for approximately 90 seconds, which was what she allowed herself, and then she stood up and went to find her locker. The shift that morning started at 7, but the nursing director had notified her via text at 7:48 that her assignment had been changed. Trauma bay, full rotation, effective immediately, pending formal paperwork. She changed into her scrubs and walked out of the locker room and turned toward the trauma bay instead of the obs wing elevator, and the difference in the walk, same building, same linoleum, same fluorescent hum, was not something she would have been able to explain to anyone who hadn't spent time being put in the wrong room of their own life. Atlas was at the nursing station. Someone had arranged for him to be there. She didn't ask who, and he was sitting at the edge of the station with his tactical vest on and his ears forward, watching the ER floor with the professional attention of an animal doing its job. Reeves had arranged temporary handler custody through Wren's team pending the broader operational review, which meant for now Atlas was here, and here was where he'd decided to be anyway. He stood when she came through the door, not with urgency, just standing. She put her hand on his head briefly, the same way she'd done in the recovery wing elevator the morning before, and he leaned into it for exactly 1 second and then straightened. Carver was 3 feet away at the station, charting, watching this with the expression of someone who had decided to file it under things she understood well enough and didn't need elaborated. She looked at Mara. Trauma Bay 2 has a post-MVA patient, 17-year-old, been waiting on a head CT, she said. Resident ordered it 20 minutes ago and nobody's followed up. I'll follow up, Mara said. I figured, Carver said. The next hours were the hours of the work, which was all they'd ever been and all she'd ever asked of them. The 17-year-old with the head CT that had been ordered and not yet transported, she fixed that, and the CT showed a minor subdural that the neurosurgery resident needed to be called about, and she called them and used the specific tone that made residents pick up the phone rather than add it to their callback list. A 62-year-old woman with a hypoglycemic episode who was scared and asking for her son, and who needed a handheld for 3 minutes before she needed anything else, she held it. A set of labs on an incoming patient that didn't match the presenting symptoms and flagged a differential the attending hadn't considered. She flagged it with the direct precision that had gotten her dismissed yesterday and would get her listened to today and probably somewhere in between going forward, because that's how institutions moved, not in transformations but in adjustments, one corrected assumption at a time. She worked the way she always worked, the way she had always worked through all of it. The years that weren't in any civilian file and the years that were, the deployments and the obs wing and the morning that had changed the shape of things. She worked because the work was real, and the people in front of her were real, and the gap between what she knew how to do and what they needed was something she could close, had always been able to close, even when the people around her hadn't known what they were standing next to. At 11:30, Nadia Reeves was moved from recovery to a regular room on the 4th floor. Mara heard about it from Carver, who heard about it from the recovery nurses, who had been following the situation with the focused interest of people adjacent to something significant. Mara finished the chart she was on and handed off to Torres, who had been assigned to the trauma bay rotation that morning, with the particular expression of someone who understood they'd been given something and wasn't sure yet what it meant. And she went upstairs. Nadia was awake. More awake than the previous evening, the post-anesthesia fog burned off, replaced by the clear, slightly raw awareness of someone who'd had a serious injury and was in the first day of knowing exactly how serious it had been. She was 23 and she looked it, young and tired and with her father's eyes and a stubbornness in her jaw that Mara recognized from having watched those same eyes in a different face process information they didn't want. Reeves was in the chair beside her bed. He stood when Mara came in, which was a formality she waved off. Don't, she said. Sit. He sat. Nadia looked at her. You're the one from the trauma bay. Yes. Atlas likes you. She looked at the dog, who had followed Mara in and was now sitting near the door with the dignified attention of an animal that understood it was in a clinical space and was behaving accordingly. He doesn't like most people. Not like that. He's particular, Mara agreed. Dad says you knew a command word. Nadia's voice had the directness of someone who'd been lying in a hospital bed with questions and had decided the direct approach was the most efficient use of time. A classified one. Yes. From before. Yes. Nadia looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at her father, then back at Mara. He told me some things. Last night, when I was more awake. Not everything. He doesn't tell me everything. That's a whole thing we're working through. A brief, complicated expression crossed her face. But enough. About the program. About what happened. Mara waited. I want to say thank you, Nadia said. Not just for yesterday. For... She paused, finding words for something that didn't have a clean shape. For being the kind of person who was there to do it. Because someone had to be, and it was you, and I don't... She stopped. I don't think thank you covers it. It covers it, Mara said. It doesn't. It does, Mara said, and she meant it, because Reeves had been right in the conference room. There was something in being thanked directly that was different from recognition, different from commendation, different from any of the institutional forms of acknowledgement. It was just one person saying to another person, I know what you did, and it mattered. The simplest transaction between humans, and for reasons that were complicated and personal and not for this room, the one she'd been least equipped to receive for the longest time. She received it. Nadia's eyes were wet, which she appeared to be annoyed about, because she blinked aggressively and looked at the ceiling for a moment the way young people do when they've decided not to cry, but their face hasn't gotten the message yet. Atlas is going to miss you, she said, to the ceiling. Mara looked at the dog. He looked back at her. He'll be fine, she said. He knows his job. He chose you, Nadia said. That's not nothing. He doesn't choose people. He assesses them and tolerates them. The choosing thing... She stopped. Dad said the red line protocol, the attachment transfer. It's a trained behavior, Mara said. He does it when certain conditions are met. Dad said the conditions require a person to have a specific profile, calm under pressure, trauma experience, handler familiarity in previous contexts. Nadia looked at her directly. He said not many people in a civilian hospital would have that profile. No, Mara said. Not many would. Which means you're not just a nurse. Mara looked at her. I'm exactly a nurse, she said. Everything I did yesterday, the fast exam, the airway management, the fluid call, the differential in the fast track annex, that's nursing. It's nursing at the edge of what the category usually contains, maybe. But the category contains more than people think. She paused. That's actually the thing I'm going to spend some time teaching, starting next week. Nadia looked at her for a long moment. Then, okay, she said. Okay? Okay, you're exactly a nurse. She looked at Atlas again. Okay. Mara left them there, Nadia and Reeves, and the particular difficult work of a father and daughter trying to build something back in a hospital room, which was not work that benefited from witnesses. And she took the elevator down with Atlas, and the elevator opened onto the ground floor, and through the ER's glass doors she could see the ambulance bay in the late morning light. 2 paramedics were offloading a gurney. She could see the shape of the incoming patient from here, adult, conscious, holding their left arm at an angle that said fracture or dislocation. Not critical. Manageable. Torres appeared at the edge of the ER floor. She saw Mara coming through the door, and she had the tablet with the incoming patient's preliminary information already. 44-year-old male, possible shoulder dislocation, came off a ladder, Torres said. Vital stable. He's in pain, but he's talking. Which bay? 3. Mara took the tablet, scanned it in 3 seconds, handed it back. Let's go. She moved through the ER floor toward Bay 3 with the unhurried directness that was the only speed she'd ever really operated at, and the staff moved around her the way they'd started to move the previous morning in the trauma bay. Not stepping aside exactly, but reorganizing. The way spaces reorganize around someone who knows what they're doing and where they're going. The kind of knowing that doesn't announce itself and doesn't need to. Atlas walked beside her left knee. The paramedics were still talking over the patient when she arrived. She listened to their handoff with the specific attention that missed nothing, and she asked the patient his name, and he told her. Marcus, said with the grimace of a man in significant pain who was still trying to be polite about it. And she said, "Okay, Marcus, I'm Mara, and we're going to get you sorted out." And she meant that too, the way she meant all of it. The work was what it had always been. The things she'd been doing in observation rooms and trauma bays and classified deployment sites and every iteration in between. The fundamental work of standing between a person and the worst version of what was happening to them, using everything available to close that gap. She had never been the person others assumed she was. She had never been only the person others assumed she was. The distance between those two things was where she'd lived for most of her professional life, and she was done pretending the distance didn't exist, and she was done being managed into corners that made other people comfortable. Not with anger. She wasn't angry. The thing she felt, stepping into Bay 3 with the patient and the paramedics, and Taurus and the ordinary urgency of a solvable problem, was something quieter and more durable than anger. She'd done the work in every room they'd put her in. She'd do it better in this one. Later, not that day, but some weeks later, when the case had moved into formal federal proceedings and the hospital's internal audit had reached its conclusions, and the training program she'd been asked to build was in its second draft, and she was sitting in the break room with actual coffee from the repaired machine, which someone had finally fixed, Carver sat down across from her and said, "How does it feel?" Mara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Different," she said. "Good different or complicated different?" "Both," she said. "At the same time, which is usually what true things feel like." Carver nodded, accepting this the way she accepted most things, without ceremony, without elaboration, with the straightforward acknowledgement of someone who'd been paying attention long enough to know when a thing was real. They drank their coffee. Somewhere in the ER, a monitor alarmed and someone responded and the sound resolved. Atlas was on the floor beside Mara's chair, one ear up, doing his continuous assessment of the space, which was the thing he did always and everywhere, the animal expression of a vigilance so practiced it had become simply who he was. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the amber gold steadiness that hadn't changed since the first morning in the trauma bay, when he'd stepped aside for someone he recognized by some deep operational calculus that didn't require words or credentials or anybody's permission. The strongest people in any room were rarely the ones the room expected. They were the ones who'd been doing the work so long and so quietly that the work had become invisible, indistinguishable from their presence, from the air they moved through, from the simple fact of their showing up every day and knowing what they were doing and doing it anyway. There was no ceremony in that. No grand moment, just the accumulation of days, of choices made in small rooms and large emergencies and every unremarkable space in between, adding up to the person you'd been the whole time, waiting for everyone else to catch up to what you already knew. Mara finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, and went back to work.